Okay, official good evening and welcome to everyone as we start our recording for tonight's class. We obviously missed last week's class. I had no voice whatsoever last week. I could have got on and maybe done some sign language or something like that, but fortunately I don't know that. And even if I did, American Sign Language doesn't match the sign language used in your part of the world. In any event, we're here this evening. We do have a class to make up, and in all likelihood, there will be a second kind of not a second session fall within one of the weeks that will be done kind of more at my convenience than yours. You're welcome to, I certainly will tell you when I intend on doing that. But if you can't make it, then basically what's going to happen is a video is going to come your way, and you'll be able to watch that and catch up at your leisure. If we need to, and I think we will need to, we'll push back the date for that midterm, so don't worry about that. And we'll just try to get back on target here. But in terms of tonight's class, we are closing out our study of the book of Psalms. It was really too brief. I hate the way we're going to be having to move in this course through this material so quickly. There's so much more that we could explore there, and I would love to do that. But I do hope to give good time to these other books that we intend to study. And so we're going to be opening up the book of Proverbs this evening. And that, of course, begins with an introduction. A book that is properly introduced is in terms of your ability to understand it, it advances your ability to understand it a lot. So it's worth the time to pause and reflect on the material that's therein. Although the book of Proverbs is unique, as you know, and we're going to be talking about that as we begin our study. So let's remind ourselves of what we have talked about in terms of wisdom literature and what we find in it. God has given us all things that relate to or pertain to what? Can anyone tell me the two things that Peter mentions there in 2 Peter 1:3?
Godliness.
Godliness and
life.
And life, right. So life and godliness. We realize that, therefore, God is interested in us being more like him, that is, in us being more godly, but God is also interested in enhancing and bettering our lives, and that really is the realm of the Proverbs. So as we think about wisdom literature, and in particular the role that Proverbs plays within wisdom literature, we remind ourselves of the fact that it is not merely a collection of wise sayings. I think we talked about this when we introduced wisdom literature, in general. But just remind ourselves, we're not encountering a series of random wise sayings. I don't know if you have an equivalent, but in the Chinese restaurants in the United States, sometimes after the meal, they give you a fortune cookie. You crack open that fortune cookie, and there's a little piece of paper on the inside. It seems to be almost entirely a weird American thing that these Chinese restaurants have decided to do. I don't know that I've noticed it in a lot of other places, but you open up there and there's this little saying on the inside, and it's very generic and shallow, and you read that and you move on, and that's sometimes how people treat the Proverbs. Unfortunately, they read it and move on. That wasn't the intention of the Proverbs, as we're going to see. Instead, it's more than a collection of wise sayings, even though it wouldn't be totally incorrect to say that about it. It's instead a book that is designed to increase our godliness and improve our life through the wisdom that is gathered from others. We'll talk about where this wisdom comes from, and who the primary author of the Proverbs is, and then who the secondary authors are, at least in terms of those stated and then those implied. So let's go ahead, as we think about Proverbs, to go ahead and wrap our minds further around that concept of life and godliness by thinking about the kind of things that we will see in the Proverbs. So a little simple diagram here that encapsulates what you see in the Proverbs. You notice the two I forget what these are called, but the circle inside of the circle, there's a technical term for that, but it's good enough for me to say that. You have areas where God commands obedience. The Proverbs discusses that. But then there are some areas that God wants to inform that do not relate necessarily to what he commands. And so these are areas where God allows liberty. Well, even though there is liberty in an area, this does not mean that God does not have information relative to that area. So, for example, we will encounter in the Proverbs some strong language against the idea of co-signing. And you say, well, if I have co-signed, have I sinned? This is a very real thing in a lot of parts of the world. Parents especially find that they oftentimes will engage in the practice of co-signing as a way of jump-starting their children's credit history and enabling them to be able to kind of get ahead in terms of transacting business in the world. And have I done wrong if I have done that? Well, you'll see from the language that even discusses co-signing that really this is not a matter of right and wrong, but a matter of better and worse. And that in general, co-signing, if the Proverbs were to inform our lives, it would be something that we would avoid. There may be exceptions and even reasoned and good exceptions. And that's why we would say that in that area, God has given us liberty. So think about the Proverbs and don't think as though that every time the Proverbs has something to say about something, that all of a sudden we are now dealing with a matter of right and wrong. We may simply be dealing with a matter of better or worse. All right. So what is a proverb? That's what we want to, obviously examine as we open up this book. We got to know what the word itself means. The word mashal is the word translated proverb, and it means actually surprisingly not something like wise saying or something like that. It means literally to represent or to be like, a representation or a likeness. In fact, the Hebrew word mashal in some places is translated using a word that we use in the New Testament, take from New Testament Greek, the word parable. A parable is a sort of likeness, or as we often have heard, a parable is an earthly story with a heavenly or a spiritual meaning behind it. There is that idea that something is being compared or something is like something else. And oftentimes parables are introduced that way. Jesus will say, the kingdom of heaven is like. So you don't see the word like in these proverbs, but there is something that is being represented, or there is some sort of likeness that is contained in a proverb typically. And well, what would that be? Well, that's going to take us a little while to get to, but we'll get there. So also translated, as I mentioned, parable, but also comparison or similitude. So not at all a word that means something like a wise saying or something like that. So the purpose of the Proverbs, as we kind of open up this book, is actually stated for us. And there's a reason why I'm jumping right into this, because it will call us to think about this term that maybe I've given you a little bit of an interesting definition for. I mean, it is the definition, but maybe something that's piqued your interest there with the word proverb. We'll be given some opportunity to pause for thought within this section of scripture that we're going to have a look at here. So let's go ahead and read Proverbs 1 through 6. And note the way the word parable, or note the way the word proverb is used in this text. So let's read Proverbs 1 through 6. Whoever feels comfortable volunteering to do that.
I can, if you like.
Sure.
Yeah. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. To know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the naive, to the youth knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. To understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles.
Okay, so here you have the content and its purpose clearly stated. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David. And what are these Proverbs? What do they aim to achieve? And you notice the infinitive statements there: to know, to understand, to receive, to give, and then and then further to understand in verse number 6. So these are the aims in broad strokes of the book of Proverbs. So let's walk through those in order. First of all, to know wisdom and understanding, rather in instruction. And the word there is the word that you find in Genesis chapter 5, and in that genealogy, that Adam knew Eve, and as the consequence of him knowing Eve, there was, of course, Seth born to that union. That's not a euphemism. It speaks to the idea of relational or intimate knowledge. So the Proverbs are designed to help us to have an intimate knowledge with wisdom and instruction. You're going to see the intimacy that one is intended to have with wisdom as you open up the first 9 chapters. And hopefully you've had a chance to read over those now, and you've seen how wisdom was portrayed by a father to his son. And the aim of that portrayal was to encourage his son to engage in a relationship with wisdom. So to have a relational level with knowledge and with wisdom and instruction. To perceive or to understand, it says in verse number 2, words of insight. And so there's relational knowledge, but then a sort of a knowledge of intricacy to get the full picture, as it were. Going on to verse number 3, to receive instruction in wise dealing, that is to take that on board, to not just know it and perceive it, but then to be able to obtain it and keep it. And so it's to receive instruction in wise dealing, but also in righteousness, justice, and equity. You'll see those terms, therefore: wisdom, circumspective intelligence, justice, right actions, judgment, right decision-making, and then equity, balance. Balance is a very important biblical concept because, you find people, being aware of the need of balance, without realizing they're aware of the need of balance. And then you find other people who maybe aren't aware at all, and then maybe don't end up achieving it. I was talking on Sunday here at Northern Lights about the importance of obedience, from the standpoint of 1 John chapter 2. And in talking about that, a brother, you said, well, obedience is important, but we also need to focus on developing a relationship with God. And, to think about obedience to the exclusion of relationship would represent a failure in equity or balance. And that's true. But if I were to say it the other way, it would also be wrong. To focus on relationship to the exclusion of obedience would also represent a failure in equity or a failure in balance. And so many things have to be kept in tension in order to properly walk the walk of faith. Wisdom literature in general, but Proverbs in particular, is designed to help us to attain that idea of balance. So continuing on with verse number 4, it says to give prudence to those who are simple. And we've already acquainted ourselves, I think, with the idea of the biblical fool and the idea of the scoffer. But let's maybe use this as an opportunity to talk about kind of these 3 terms as they work together: the simple, the fool, and the scoffer. So the biblical person who is simple is simply one who does not know. We come to the scriptures as those who are simple, and it's okay to be someone who is simple. Now, the person who chooses to keep his simplicity is a person who then becomes a biblical fool. The person who chooses to be militant in his foolishness is the person who becomes a scoffer. So you find that the biblical fool, in terms of his simplicity, he either chooses not to know better, or once he knows better, chooses to reject what he knows. And then how he rejects would then determine whether or not he drifts over to that word scoffer or not. So keep those three terms in mind. Don't be surprised if I ask you about them again, because they are littered all throughout the Psalms, and then certainly throughout the Proverbs as well. But the simple person, the foolish person, and the scoffer. But here, the simple person is given prudence through the Proverbs. And notice how simplicity is often, attributed to youth or to a lack of experience. We can read this, and when we say it says here to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth, we can kind of look at that and say, hey, maybe I feel like I'm older than some in my congregation, or I've been a Christian longer than others in my congregation, and maybe this doesn't have application to me. Well, we'll go on to say that even those who are wise and understanding can gain something from this study, verse 5, but realize that being a spiritual youth, it really doesn't have a lot to do with your physical age. Youth, in terms of your spiritual growth and development, has more to do with how you've advanced in faith than it has to do with any calendar advancement. All right, so just realize that youth travels with fool, but that doesn't mean this is only a message for those who are young. Now, it says it will give prudence to allow the person who is simple to act in a way that keeps him out of trouble. It will also give knowledge, and then discretion there. So knowledge is informational awareness, and discretion, it's sort of a plan of action. So I mean, these terms, there's probably some overlap, and I've chosen to highlight the definitions that create a little bit of a story. But at the same time, you can see how there's just this really holistic knowledge that is coming across in terms of the aim of the Proverbs. It wants to give you this really well-rounded, understanding of the way that life works. All right. So informational awareness and a plan of action. But then we come to this puzzling point in verse number 6. Of course, in verse 5, the person who feels like they've advanced to a certain degree can still gain something from the study. But verse number 6, it says, to understand a proverb, saying the words of the wise and their riddles, or enigma, as it says there instead of saying. But isn't that circular reasoning? How can a proverb help me understand a proverb? Anyone want to take a stab at that before we kind of have our discussion stem forward from there? How does a proverb help me understand a proverb?
Well, complexity, as we've kind of hinted at, is a process, right? Complexity as the opposite of simplicity, right? That to move out of your simpleness into a more complex understanding takes time, which is why we expect someone who's been on the path longer to have progressed more and become more complex in their understanding. But just as each journey has many steps, there'll be many chances for you to deepen and enrich your knowledge and your understanding. And so, one thing might open up a door that you'd never thought of, that then helps you see something else, that then helps you see something else, that then helps you see something else. In a similar way to how the, as you said, the
So was it, sorry?
No, I had another thing and then my brain let it fall out. So.
It's all right. It happens. So I like the way that you say that one group of one set of understanding can open the door to further sets of understanding, and that really is what is happening as you study the Proverbs, both in terms of what's happening within your study of the book itself. So, like, you might understand one portion of the Proverbs, and then another portion, or maybe another passage within the Proverbs becomes easier to understand. But it could be that also, given the meaning, the very meaning of this term, that you study the Proverbs in their entirety, and you begin to understand more about things that are similar in nature that you encounter in life. So Proverbs are designed both in of themselves to impart wisdom and to also teach you to think proverbially. That's I haven't trademarked that yet, but that's I don't know if that's a real if that's a real adverb or not, but at least not in the way that I'm using it, maybe. But to think proverbially is to think in a way where you are reflecting on things for their similitude or for their likeness or for what they can be cast beside, to use our understanding of the word parable, to increase and enhance my understanding. So, question to pause and reflect upon, do I think proverbially? So you look at that sign, and clearly there's a warning in that sign to avoid the edge of a cliff, because and coming to the edge of the cliff, you might fall off. There might be a rock slide, etc. You might find yourself at the bottom of that cliff face. And so, the reasonable response to a sign like that would be to step back. But what am I going to do if I'm looking at that sign proverbially? I might say, well, imagine that the cliff, as it were, is the line dividing right and wrong, and the person who's gone off the cliff is the person who has plunged himself into the depths of sin. Well, where do I want to stand in relationship to that cliff edge? Do I want to venture to the edge of it, to get as close as I possibly can, to take the classic, selfie on that cliff edge? People do that all the time when they see those signs. They ignore them and kind of go to the cliff edge and take that selfie. Look how close I am to the edge here. And sometimes people do that with sin, don't they? They try to get as close as they possibly can to sin without somehow sinning. And look how close I am. And many people who ignore the signs wind up again plunging themselves over the edge. So this is an example of proverbial thinking. And you could look at a sign, you could look at an animal. In Proverbs, we're going to see the father look at an ant. He's going to look at an ant and say, what can I learn from an ant? What can I learn from the industriousness of an ant? How can I use an ant to help my son understand the importance of hard work and being active? So again, the Proverbs will teach you simply by studying them to engage life in a more reflective and meditative way. And that really is what proverbial thinking is. It is to think about life in that way. So how do the Proverbs work in terms of giving, of achieving the aims that they set out here in Proverbs 1:1-6? Well, the assumption with the Proverbs is that life begins and ends with God. And so there is no area of life that really just has nothing to do with God. There may be areas in which God has given me liberty, but at the same time, even when I exercise my liberty, I should not use it, to use the words of Paul, as an opportunity to engage in fleshly behavior or as an occasion to the flesh, but I should use it as an opportunity to find an avenue to further my service towards God and towards others. Someone read Proverbs 1:7 for us, please.
Fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline.
All right. So a proper regard for God is where knowledge begins. Proverbs sort of encourage you to make that decision and then to live with it consequentially. If it's really true that you fear God, what are you going to do? Notice how fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but notice the opposite of the fear of the Lord is those who are foolish. It is foolish not to fear the Lord, and therefore fools despise wisdom and instruction. within the knowledge that God would grant you is wisdom and instruction. So again, Proverbs is designed to move you forward towards God once you have decided to begin with God. How do they do that, though? That's really what we're trying to get at here. Sometimes the Proverbs will teach very directly. Okay, let's have someone read chapter 14 and verse 34.
Proverbs 14:34. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people.
Not a whole lot of proverbial reflection, so to speak, on that proverb. It's very, very straightforward. You could try to move beyond maybe the framework of thinking about a physical nation to maybe a spiritual one. The Israel of God is the Church of Christ. We are a nation, Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9. So maybe there's a lesson here for us as well about how righteousness can exalt us as spiritual Israel, but then how sin can become a reproach to us very quickly, congregationally, and then brotherhood wide. But then, really the straightforward meaning of the proverb is more a commentary on society and how we can see societies benefit from choosing paths of righteousness and see them, when they fail to do so, bringing reproach upon themselves eventually. Those societies that live in abject rebellion to God, as they, even though they are given great patience and latitude by God, eventually find their end and, or at least find their reform. So fairly direct statement there. But sometimes the statement isn't so direct. And sometimes even the thing that you're meant to be taking and bringing comparison to something else is in of itself unclear. And so you have to stop and think. And you walk away and you wonder, have I gotten that all the way? And that really is your indication that maybe you could go back to that thought later and continue to reflect upon it. Someone read Proverbs 30 verses 18 and 19.
Three things are too wonderful for me, four I do not understand: the way of the eagle in the sky, the way of the serpent on the rock, the way of the ship in the high sea, the way of a man with a virgin.
What do you think, just in reflecting on those? We will, if we get time, be revisiting the words of Agur later, which is what Proverbs 30 contains. But reflecting on those, what do you think is the point of those four things that are brought into comparison there? Which of those do you think is probably maybe the key to understanding what's happening with the others? You could continue to read verse 20. This is the way of an adulteress. She eats and wipes her mouth and says, I have done no wrong. So this is the way. We've got four things described in verse 19 and then brought into comparison with verse 20. Still, what is the comparison? What is the point? Well, I'd argue that, given that we maybe haven't thought a lot about this, I'd argue personally that the emphasis of this text is not on animal observation, right? So we're not concerned really with eagles when with serpents, nor are we concerned with seafaring navigation, so the way of a ship on a high sea. But really, human relationships seems to be the point, both in that fourth line, the way of a man with a virgin, And then the thing that this is ultimately all compared to in verse 20, this is the way of an adulteress. Now let's pause and think about what might be the common thread between these, and then number two, what might be the point. So the way of an eagle in the sky. How do eagles fly as opposed to, like, let's say a hummingbird? What's the difference between an eagle and a hummingbird?
They hover and soar.
Yeah, the eagles primarily hover and soar. They ride thermal air currents, and so as these subtle unseen changes in the air relate to how the eagle is actually flying in the sky. So unseen forces are at work with an eagle. What about the way of a serpent on a rock? You know, we lived before coming here to Alaska. We lived in Arizona, and there were any number of snakes and lizards all about the place. But there's a difference in seeing a lizard on a rock and a snake on a rock. Lizard moves on a rock, and you can see its legs. You can see the legs moving, and you know how it gets from one place to another. But what about a snake? Well, subtle contractions within the snake's body, the expansion and retraction of itself essentially is what causes a snake to move. And so you don't really see the snake moving when you see the snake move. And so again, sort of unseen forces are propelling that snake up that rock. What about a ship on a high sea? What causes a ship to turn? You can consult the New Testament for the answer to that. What causes a ship to turn?
Rudder.
The rudder. And where is the rudder in terms of your ability to observe the ship?
It's underneath.
Water.
It's underneath the water, so you don't see it. So you don't see it. You simply see the effects of it. So again, unseen forces. And maybe the point with all of that is, again, in the fourth thought, unseen forces are also what causes relationships to unfold. There are any number of men who have wound up marrying any number of women, and you will look at the men and you will look at the woman, and you'll say, how in the world did that happen? And I find myself in one of those marriages myself. People look at me and they look at my wife and they say, how in the world did that happen? You don't know. And love can work like that. But those same unseen forces that are at work in moving things and moving relationships can also move in terms of the wrong kind of relationships. And maybe, just maybe, there can be someone who is in control of those things. There is always someone moving the relationship forward in terms of a man with a maid or a virgin. There's always intentionality with the pilot of the ship, or with the snake or the eagle. And so the adulteress uses those unseen forces of love and, unfortunately, of lust to so to speak, make a meal of an unsuspecting victim. And she has done her work. She wipes her mouth. She's finished, and she says, I haven't done anything wrong, because it was that unseen force, perhaps of again, love and lust that was at play. She would call it love. The Bible would call it lust. So again, you look at all that and you say, wow, that you didn't get that right at first in reading that, but by pausing and reflecting and meditating, maybe that's the point. And maybe instead of just being carried along by these unseen forces of life, maybe we should exercise a little bit more control, and certainly as relates to sexual sin and guarding the marriage bed. So continuing though, sometimes in looking at the Proverbs, we saw that the righteousness that exalts a nation proverb, that's a very face value kind of proverb. Sometimes, and in fact, often I might argue, Proverbs are not meant to be taken just at face value. Like the point of the parable is not the parable itself. Like sometimes people will use Matthew 25 in Jesus's discussion of the parable of the talents as an encouragement to invest your money in a bank. Well, I don't think that that's the point of Jesus's parable. I think that's an element within the parable, but really the point of that parable is about preparedness for the judgment day. And it's about, instead of investing your money in the bank, maybe invest your life in Christian service. So the Proverbs, being parables, being similitudes or likenesses, are like that. Someone read Proverbs 6, 4, and 5, though, for a different kind of cause to pause and think.
Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes.
Now, wait, did the Bible just say that we are to answer a fool and then answer not a fool? Is that a Bible contradiction? Should we, go ahead and pack it up right now because we've discovered what people have been looking for, through the ages, the contradiction in the Bible, and we shouldn't believe in the Bible anymore? What do you think?
No, I mean, obviously.
Well, good. Thank you. Hoping everybody would jump in on that one, but
yeah.
Continue though.
I mean, you can see here, right, that so we're presuming that the writer here is presuming a certain level of wisdom, or at least a wisdom above that of the fool in the writing here, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a certain amount of that judgment, that discernment there of what is going to be the result of you answering back and how you answer back. Are you going to answer back to the fool in a way that makes you a fool as well, right? If you get overworked and make a scene and perhaps speak off the cuff in a way that you weren't prepared and say something in error, is that how you're going to answer? Because then you shouldn't have answered. Are you going to answer in a way that gives enlightenment? Are you going to answer in a way that brings understanding to those who are listening to you? Then you need to say that, because that will improve everyone else, right? How will you answer?
So again, the encouragement is ultimately to answer a fool, but the what you said is quite accurate. If you don't intend to answer appropriately, if you answer off the cuff, if you answer without truly understanding yourself, then the act of you answering will actually make the situation worse. There are times when I've been in serious discussions, Bible discussions, and I just hear somebody say something, and I just really wish they would not say that. please stop talking. I'm saying in my mind, please stop talking. There was a ladies' Bible study that my wife was telling me about. She was at one time, and there was a question that was asked, and ultimately some false information that was given, as a response to that question. And she was just saying, please stop talking. And we all probably have experiences like that. And the point is that one, we need to be prepared when we answer, but then two, that we need to answer ultimately, because if we don't, then the fool wins. The message that of the fool is the one that wins. I had a teacher once that said you have to beware the hand of I'm getting ahead of myself. Beware the sound of one hand clapping, and the sound of one hand clapping is that hand coming and slapping you on the face because you have something that wasn't appropriately met and stopped before it could bring harm to you. And so again, we have to be active in response. But as we think about the nature of the Proverbs and the fact that therefore, you see here that they're not always meant to be taken at face value. Again, primary thing happening in the Proverbs is this sort of proverbial instruction where we are getting the opportunity to think in different layers. All right. So let's see an illustration of this in Proverbs 25 and verse 16.
If you have found honey, eat only enough for you, lest you have your fill and vomit it.
One of the more profound statements, right? Don't eat too much or you'll throw up. Well, again, that's probably not the most profound statement. I mean, I'm being a little bit sarcastic in saying that. And, what child even hasn't experienced that kind of thing? Right now, we in this country have just finished Halloween. I don't know how big of a deal Halloween is in where you live, but often it's a pretty big deal here. And kids go around, they get all this candy, and they find out very quickly if you eat too much candy, then you get sick. But what is the point of the proverb? Is it trying to keep us from getting sick? Is it trying to keep us from eating too much?
Isn't the point of
honey?
the proverb? Isn't the point of the proverb explained in verse 17?
In what way?
Well, it starts off 16 says, "If you found honey, eat only enough for you, lest you have your fill of it and vomit it. Let your foot be seldom in your neighbour's house, that he have his fill of you and hate you." And so, if we have too much, we can wear out our welcome.
So, in this portion of the book of Proverbs, there are, kind of 4-line kind of thoughts that happen. We'll talk about that when we divide up the book of Proverbs a little bit for ourselves. And so, I mean, yes, there is a comparison between having too much honey and having too much visitation, right? But to say that even that is the kind of the end all of meaning here, I think would be to miss out on other opportunities for learning. So with the Proverbs, try to train yourself to, at times, especially in this portion of the book of Proverbs, maybe we'll think about the couplets, in conjunction as you have, but try to think about those statements even in isolation, and then try to think about things again that you can compare them to. So what really would you walk away from this proverb with an understanding of at its base level? Well, you could say an understanding of how you should engage eating sweets, but that maybe the bigger picture lesson would be a lesson on moderation. Maybe then from that, you could reflect upon how maybe moderation needs to be experienced and you're given that maybe immediate application in verse 17, moderation in relationship, but then moderation in other things, in recreation, in consumption in my family, in terms of maybe instead of buying the nicest and the finest and the best, that we do a little less of that. When we find out, whenever we suggest to our children that we're going to, eat out at a restaurant, and it doesn't bring excitement, then that means that we're probably doing too much of that. It's a sign that something that is supposed to be special has not become special anymore because it's become commonplace. And there's so many ways that you can then take that. I want you to kind of picture the Proverbs like you picture an onion, right? So an onion has an external layer, but oftentimes, I don't know about you, but when we get especially brown onions from the grocery store, you peel back the first layer or two, and you hardly use those at all in cooking. What you really want to get to is those deeper layers, so to speak. And I think that's what you'll find yourself doing as you meditate and reflect upon the Proverbs. You'll say that there's not just wisdom for this one kind of situation, or even in this case, with verses 16 and 17, these two situations, there's wisdom here that can be applied to other situations. Appreciate you mentioning that. So Proverbs in chapters 10 through 29, will say generally do not have context. What do I mean by they do not have context? I mean that especially in the kind of the meat part of the book and the middle chapters, you're going to find lines that aren't couplets as are found in this example that we just gave, lines that are just meant to stand alone and really reflected upon without considering the verse that came before it or after it. So they generally do not have context. They though number two, they make use of parallelism like we've seen in the Psalms. So within the proverb, there is this sort of context that's built by the things that are set in these parallel lines, and you're meant as a part of your meditation and reflection to think about those things that are brought up in comparison, and maybe allow that to continue your meditation and discussion. So parallelism, just to give a refresher on this, is restatement of thoughts for emphasis and also for added understanding. What were the two major kinds of parallelism that we talked about previously?
One is similar, where they are similar, and the other is opposite.
Yep. Similar lines and opposite lines. We gave you synonymous as a term to remember, which means similar. Restatement through words or phrases that have the same meaning. And then antithetic is the technical term for the opposite. Restatement through opposites, right? And so just keep that in mind as you're reading the Proverbs, that you're going to be seeing parallelism, and that you're going to be seeing primarily, these two, basic forms. So to get ourselves back on the gear of thinking, like I said, I know it's been a couple of weeks. We'll see these at work. Proverbs 21:17. He who loves pleasure will be a poor man. He who loves wine and oil will not be rich. What kind of parallelism is that? That's synonymous parallelism. But within that, what do you have? Well, you have basically two groups in each line, or rather a grouping in each line that are brought into comparison. So let me put this up here so that makes more sense. He who loves pleasure draws a comparison with he who loves wine and oil. And so wine and oil would represent the finer things of life, not necessarily, and we'll talk about this with our study of Proverbs, not necessarily alcoholic wine, but think about it like Timothy. Timothy was a person who literally only drank water and didn't engage in anything that was beyond what was absolutely necessary to live. And and so wine and oil would represent, therefore, the things that are excess to what is necessary to live, the finer things. And he who therefore loves pleasure is as compared to that. And a poor man, very simply put, is one who will not be rich. And so you can find synonymous statements made by way of negation. That doesn't, just because you see a negative doesn't mean that you see an opposite. But antithetic parallelism, here's another example of that. Proverbs 28 verse 4. Those who forsake the law praise the wicked, but such as keep the law contend with them. And here's a good opportunity to see how parallel lines can be reflected upon, just like the content of the proverb can be reflected on. So those who forsake the law is clearly opposite of those who keep the law. I mean, that's pretty straightforward. What about that second element in the groupings? Those who praise the wicked are set in opposition to those who contend with them. So what is it to take the opposite course of praising the wicked? Some might say that the opposite of praising the wicked would be to say nothing about the wicked. But no, from the standpoint of this proverb, the person who doesn't praise the wicked is the person who contends with that, contends with that wicked person. And vice versa would also be true. If you're not contending with the wicked, then you are praising them. Similar kind of, ways of thinking are found in Paul, right? He talks about the old man and the new man. You engage Paul in Ephesians 4. He says that let him that stole steal no more. Well, what's the opposite of stealing no more? It's not stop stealing. It's actually, and it's not even work, which he goes on to say to do. He says, rather let him work with his hands that he may give to him who has need. And so the opposite of stealing is giving. The opposite of praising is contending here. So again, you can't be moral by being neutral. All right. Well, any questions on any of the materials so far? We've rolled through a good portion of our introduction, but I want to pause here and ask if there's what questions we have or any further, maybe reflections you've had on some of the things we've said. All right. Well, we are going to go ahead and take an opportunity to take a break. So I will pause recording. Okay. We are back and going to continue with our introduction to the book of Proverbs here. So we'll now turn our attention to some thoughts relative to authorship. Ask the question, who wrote Proverbs? So the quick and easy answer would be the one we saw at chapter 1 and verse 1. And that would be simply to say that Solomon was the author of the book of Proverbs, and he is indeed given credit for most of the Proverbs. So you'll find that Proverbs, as we move through it, is comprised of at least, kind of 4 major collections, and really more than that, I would say. But, in terms of, the way that the content kind of structures up. So you have Proverbs 1 through 9, from the perspective of the father to his son, 10 through 29, the 1 or at times 2 line, sayings and so on from various sources we're going to find out. But then, and then content written by Agur in chapter 30, the content written by Lemuel, chapter 31. So those are the 4 major sections, and then some little other subsections within chapters 10 through 29. But within various points, we're given the idea that Solomon is indeed the author of most of these things, with the exception of obviously chapters 30 and 31. Proverbs 1:1 we already read. Can someone read 10:1 and then 25:1?
(25:1). These are more Proverbs of Solomon, copied by the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah.
All right. So I'll go ahead and read 10:1, and then we'll comment on what we just now read in 25:1. But Proverbs of Solomon: a wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is a sorrow to his mother. You might wonder, well, why is 10:1 the Proverbs of Solomon, when we just saw 1:1, that these were the Proverbs of Solomon? Well, again, because there's clearly a different section between 1 through 9, and then what happens in verses 10 and following. Then again, in chapter 25, there's an indication that during the time of Hezekiah, which we know was a time of reform amongst God's people, there was a discovery given to further Proverbs that Solomon had written, and then in grafting of those onto the existing material. Now, does that continue along to chapters 30 and 31 as well? Or where does that end exactly? And I can't say that I know. Again, it's just like with the book of Psalms, even though I believe that the content speaks towards, a compiling over time, right? As opposed to all of these things being produced at the same time and then bound together and then, shipped out as the book of Psalms or the book of Proverbs. Even though I think that there's the indication, like I said, that I've had all that happening over time, I don't know that we have a lot of indication as to how that happened or the stages, so to speak. So we have to take it at face value that, again, maybe a smaller book of Proverbs was being circulated amongst the Jews, and that God saw fit in his providence for some further material to be discovered and then engrafted into that book during the time of Hezekiah. And you could even argue that reading forward from chapter 25, verse 1, maybe there's wisdom particular to the time of Hezekiah that was discovered during that time. So again, it wasn't that God's people wouldn't have benefited from it before, but maybe they especially benefited from it during the time of Hezekiah and what was going on at that time. So anyway, having said that, we come face to face at times with the idea that maybe this isn't all the product of Solomon's pen. Let's look at chapter 22 and verse 17. Someone could read that, please.
22:17. Incline your ear and hear the words of the wise, and apply your heart to my knowledge.
All right. So is the author speaking about himself in the third person? Or could it be that he wants to be heard, my knowledge, and also he wants others to be heard, the words of the wise? Chapter 24 and verse 23. Can someone read that?
These also are the sayings of the wise. To show partiality in judgment is not good.
Now that's even more clear than the previous statement. These are the sayings of the wise. So not just the sayings of Solomon, but the sayings of those others that Solomon perhaps has known or heard of or discovered who are wise. So what is that? What is the long and short of what we're trying to say here? Well, one, Proverbs is primarily written by Solomon, but two, as you can see, even from Proverbs 25:1, there was a sort of curation and cultivation of the book of Proverbs, a gathering of material. And perhaps with Solomon's wisdom, he wasn't just wise in terms of being able to write what was wise, but also to be able to discover what was wise. And then again, through God's oversight and with his inspiration, see that those other wise sayings were ultimately brought in to the ultimate inspired product of the book of Proverbs. So I don't want you, when you're reading the book of Proverbs, to be surprised to find that there are similar statements in literature that surrounds both the biblical world, but then also the global, world. Global world. I don't know if that's redundant or not, but the fact is that wisdom exists. Sometimes people will say maybe the Bible's copying, or the Bible isn't unique in the kind of things that it says and all that. At one time, what did the entirety of humanity consist of? Adam and Eve. Going forward, what did the entirety of humanity consist of? Noah and his family. So should it shock and surprise us when wisdom perhaps is discovered in these other cultures and these other places that mirrors what God's people knew? No, I think that it speaks, instead of against the Bible, it actually is a defense of the Bible's telling of things. To say that there's a time when people had access to this information, to this knowledge, and then that's part of the consideration. But then the other part of the consideration is that God actually approves of the idea of people observing life and learning how to live better. And so the book of Proverbs maybe it stands as a testimony at times on, and I don't know that it's a majority of the material by any means, but at times to, somebody outside of the community of faith observing life in a proper way and drawing a reasonable conclusion. There are people who actually will, and I forget the exact chapter numbers, how this lines up, do a great deal of comparative study between a portion of the Proverbs and some material that was found down in Egypt at roughly the same kind of time period. And we're speaking always in broad terms in this in this period before Christ, but they compare Proverbs with material from Egypt. Why would that not be surprising from the biblical record? What do we know about Solomon? Did he have any interactions with Egypt?
His wife's sister.
Yeah, he married an Egyptian princess, and so it's not at all surprising that in the process of his gleaning wisdom from various places, that maybe he gleaned some wisdom from the Egyptians as well. Of course, having said that, it's unfortunate that Solomon gleaned the wrong kind of wisdom and false wisdom at times from his wives. They led his heart astray. But just because there is a lot of false information found in the world around us doesn't mean there isn't at times good information in the world around us. Proverbs is our reminder of that fact, perhaps. So, two authors besides Solomon are mentioned by name, and we kind of said them in passing just a moment ago. The first of these is Agur, the son of Jacob. We don't know anything about Agur. We'll talk about his contribution in our study of Proverbs 30, which will probably be one of the later things we do in our study of Proverbs. But then also Lemuel. Now, Lemuel, there's a couple of things to be thought about here in Proverbs 31. Does the entirety of the chapter represent something that was written by Lemuel, including the section regarding the virtuous woman? Is this more the mother speaking? Because it says, and it highlights the fact that Lemuel was instructed by his mother. So maybe this is more the mother's instruction, and maybe that adds a little bit of meditative reflection to the idea of how do we prepare our son for marriage? We maybe would teach him what kind of woman he ought to discover, and maybe the virtuous woman then was Lemuel's mother, trying to describe to him what kind of woman he should be looking for, that kind of thing. I don't know. But Lemuel, though, also interpretively means one who's devoted to God. And there's some who might argue that maybe that's a pen name for Solomon. Why he would take a pen name, I don't know. But anyway, Agur and Lemuel, two individuals who are identified as authors in the book of Proverbs, besides Solomon. So I mentioned this already, and this is now where we'll kind of lay it out. The book can be divided into sections. Chapters 1 through 9 is a father's instruction to a son, and so you'll find the sections will roll forward with "my son here," or some digression of that formula, "my son here." But then chapter 10 through 15, and this is trying to subdivide chapters 10 through 29. There will be exceptions because I don't know that it technically was meant to be divided like 1 through 9 and then 30 and 31. But you're going to find more often than synonymous. You'll find more often antithetical two-line sayings in 10 through 15. More often synonymous than antithetical two-line sayings in 16 through 22. More often synonymous four-line sayings, which of course we saw this other thing then. We saw a four-line saying rather in our examination of chapter 25, and so it's not only here, but miscellaneous two-line sayings primarily in 25 through 29, and then the writings of Agur and the writings of Lemuel, which may or may not have been heavily influenced by his mother. All right. And I'll give you just a second to copy that or to screenshot it. So going forward, we're going to try to spend a bit of time in Proverbs 1 through 9. And then we'll try to, I actually had the opportunity to, through an online class, teach the entire book of Proverbs. And I can tell you, if you try to go verse by verse in chapters 10 through 29, it takes a long time. So we'll have to kind of hit the high points and, just talk about a few. This will be an opportunity between now and the next class. If there are any Proverbs in particular that you would love to have discussed in class, feel free to write me and send me those, and we will try to put them into our study either next week or the week following, and then we'll wrap up with chapters 30 and 31. So, conclusion of our introduction material. Book of Proverbs is a part of Old Testament wisdom literature designed to get us to think proverbially. I want you to remember that, to think proverbially, to get us to see more than the surface. We're not to judge according to the appearance, Jesus said. And that's not true. That's supposed to be the way we engage people, but I would suggest it's also the way we're supposed to engage Proverbs. All right. Going to do a new share of this slideshow now. All right. So let's begin to have a look at Proverbs 1 through 9. And this is From a Father to a Son, is the little title that I've given this. I highly recommend spending a lot of time with Proverbs 1 through 9 if you are a parent or a primary caregiver to children. It's just a really important section of Scripture to reflect upon. You are seeing on display inspired, God-approved parenting. What does that look like? What does it look like both in terms of the way that things are discussed? What does it look like in terms of the kind of topics that are brought up? So reading Proverbs 1 through 9, given that is the content, we're getting advice from a father to his son, with the formulaic "Hear, my son," or "My son, hear," or something like that, beginning new sections of discussion. Primarily, we'll note that there are exceptions to that. We're going to see that there are primary topics of discussion, at least 10 kind of key admonitions that kind of form the heart of the message, and then some further instruction that surrounds those. Really, when you think about what this text is designed to do, you ask yourself the question, as a parent, as a grandparent, as an aunt or an uncle, what do I want my child to know? And so often, those kind of answers are informed by secular goals. I want my child to know the value of a good education, the importance of a well-paying job, the importance of a savings account, or being responsible with credit. And even though there might be minor ways that those things dip into the realm of the Proverbs, you're going to find that the Proverbs are much more practical and to the point, and that maybe what is prioritized in the Proverbs really ought to be what is prioritized to us as well. What's going to be a major topic of discussion when a father is talking to his son? Well, you're going to find a lot of talk about romance, but also you're going to find even more talk about wisdom and growing, developing and learning, and using life as an opportunity to know God better. So the themes that come up in Proverbs 1 through 9, among others, you're going to find peer pressure, though, also, and how to choose friends discussed. Really important that our children know how to choose appropriate peers and be influenced by the right kind of people. Sexual aggression in the opposite sex is going to be considered. It's you read the Proverbs, and the opposite sex is always kind of painted as the like the aggressor. And the reason is because, the Proverbs assumes that, the son is pursuing this life of faith and is not going to take that role. So, but at the same time, that there would be lessons to learn from considering it in both ways, and then also from realizing that even though the son is the audience of these chapters, to consider it from the standpoint of a daughter. Managing money is a major topic of discussion as well. So, we talk about that and are told to do that from the secular world, but it is an important thing. Money can be a great undoing to many people. Just recently, a preacher that I know about, he ended up effectively losing his position as a preacher because of money issues, and he had a gambling problem, and just it can really be the undoing of even people who are godly. Appreciating wisdom and God's way, though, I would say would form the bulk of this material, and either obviously talking about how to engage God and His truth, but then also idealizing wisdom, and we'll see how the Father does that in just a few moments. So, reflecting on this text, I want you to do three things. I want you to, first of all, to read it as God's child. I want you to read it, and instead of thinking about little children or thinking about how you're not really dealing with this temptation or this problem right now or whatever, stop and say, no, I am God's child, and there's a lesson here that I need to consider, even if it's just by way of reminder. So learn for yourself first would be my instruction. And then after you learn for yourself, reflect upon it as a member of a family. So are you a son or a daughter? What are you learning about your parent in this text? Are you, though, a parent or a grandparent? What are you learning about the way that you can instruct your child or grandchild through this text? Or if you are, again, a primary caregiver, what can I learn about how to raise these souls that have been entrusted in my care? But then number three, reflect upon it as a member of God's family. That is to say, reflect on it, realizing that you are in a church community that is comprised of people who are old in the faith and young in the faith. How can you advance those who are young in the faith? How can you see the next generation mature and not fall away? Well, these would be the kinds of discussions that you would need to have, the kind of topics that you need to make sure that are covered. So there's a lot of learning that can be done here for parents, but a lot of learning that can be done here for church leaders as well, and trying to ensure that in the rotation of what we teach and talk about, these topics are covered. All right. So we'll just be, like I said, kind of walking through the text. Again, very broad strokes because of the lack of time that we have, but let's have a look at having looked at the first 6 verses, the need to listen to the right sources. So the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Hear, my son, your father's instruction. Forsake not your mother's teaching, for they are a graceful garland for your head, pendants for your neck. The need for when we're engaging instruction is obviously to hear the Lord, verse 7. But notice how the son is told that he also needs to hear his mother and father. We don't want to be people who become islands in Bible study. An island in Bible study is a person who only looks to his or her own learning or wisdom. I can't tell you how many times I have heard Christians, speak about the danger of commentaries. I don't know if you ever have had that discussion at your congregation, but the danger of commentaries. I got to be careful with those commentaries. We need to just read the Bible and be careful with commentaries. And I want to say something about, what is happening in a Bible class. a Bible class is effectively an oral commentary. Teacher in a Bible class, even though they haven't necessarily written out all the words that they are saying, they are commenting on the text. Commentary is not a bad thing. And in fact, commentary in general is quite a necessary thing, a part of even God's design, you might say. In Acts chapter 8, when the Ethiopian eunuch is reading the book of Isaiah, he is asked the question, do you understand what you're reading? Remember what his response was? What did he say?
Unless somebody explains to me.
Yeah, I can't understand this unless someone explains it to me. And that is the way that God designed it. The truth is carried in the book of Acts from person to person. And so commentary is an important thing, you know. Now, what you might have been warned about, obviously, is a denominational commentary. And I think that is definitely a worthwhile warning, you know, because the denominational world, even though they occasionally reach the conclusions that ought to be reached, they often are applying a different approach to the scripture than God's people are. And, you know, that it's just a different way of engaging the word of God that at times yields some very, very wrong, you know, results. And so, you know, I'm sure let's be careful with that. But to say, you know, I just need to be a person who studies the Bible and I need to be careful about all commentaries is not proverbial, nor is it biblical. You know, listen to your father, listen to your mother, and take what they say as well as what God says, and allow those things to beautify your life. Keep them with you. It says in verse 9, a graceful garland for your head, pendants for your neck. Next major topic of discussion in chapter 1, verses 10 through 19 is a peer pressure discussion. You notice again the way that there's a break here, my son. So my son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. And how are these sinners enticing him? What's the pressure from these peers? They say, come with us, let us lie in wait for blood. Let us ambush the innocent without reason. Like Sheol, let us swallow them alive and whole, like those who go down to the pit. Why would we want to do this? Why would we want to hurt anybody? Because we will find all precious goods. We will fill our houses with plunder. And not only that, but there's a sort of brotherhood that will come in doing this. Throw in your lot among us. We will all have one purse. We will share with each other. We'll be together, and it'll be us against them. And that's the way a lot of peer groups form. It's our group, and it's the us and the them. But he says, don't obviously follow their paths, and don't do that because it's wrong. Verse 16, their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed blood, but not just because it's wrong. Notice verse 17, for in vain is a net spread in the sight of any bird. What is that? Vain is a net spread in the sight of any bird. It starts with a P. Starts with a PR. Starts with a PRO. You got it? Somebody gonna say it? PROV. Don't make me spell it out.
Which verse?
In verse 17.
17.
Trouble.
What's that? It is a proverb. Okay. I don't know if we're going to get there, but it's a proverb. So why did he say in vain is a net spread in the sight of any bird?
Because what you catch, the birds are going to be after.
Okay, could be. So maybe the idea you're picturing more of a hunting thing. When I read that, I'm thinking about maybe the fact that maybe the bird itself is what's being hunted, right? So rather than necessarily the because what does it mean when something is in vain? It's foolish or empty. And so you're trying to catch a bird, right? And you spring your trap when they can see you do so. What's the bird going to do?
Fly away.
Fly away, right? So why shouldn't you do this? Number one, it's wrong. Number two, it's not going to work. Because notice it says here, as we move on to the application of this proverb, in vain is a net spread in the sight of any bird. You can't catch a bird this way, is the point of that proverb. These men lie in wait for their own blood. They set an ambush for their own lives. They're trying to catch something, but they're going to catch nothing really ultimately but themselves. They're going to be what they're doing is in vain. It's not going to work. And so ultimately in verse 19, such are the ways of everyone who is greedy for unjust gain, takes away the life of its possessors. So maybe as a parent, I can help my child to see what is wrong, but better than doing just that, I can help them to see why it's wrong. Why is this a bad idea? Why is this appeal not so appealing? They speak about spoil, they speak about brotherhood. What really are they doing? And how's this all going to end? And so just walking them through that it will help them to make the choice that really they ought to. I heard a lot. We're going to move forward in this book and encounter passages that deal with sexuality, but I heard a lot growing up as relates to that topic of don't, but didn't hear always a lot of how, or even always a lot of why. I think that's what you're getting here in this section of scripture. You get the don't, but then you get the how and also the why. Well, chapter 1, verses 20 through 33 is an example of the thing that happens occasionally within this section of scripture where we move away from the kind of more formula, my son here, to these sort of little interjections by wisdom. And wisdom is pictured in these 9 chapters as being personified. So she's a person, and I've said she, so she's also pictured as a female. Now, why might that be appropriate for a young man?
Attractive.
What's that? Yeah, it's attractive. He's trying to portray wisdom as something attractive to this young man. So wisdom is presented as this available, helpful, beautiful woman. And and so chapter 1, verses 20 through 33, she calls out and also promises that there will be destruction for those who don't find her, and then also there will be a time when she cannot be found because it will be too late. And so take wisdom when it's on offer would be the lesson from this little kind of interlude. Let's move to the next my son section in chapter 2, verses 1 through 9, and talk about getting in a position to listen to wisdom. I really like this picture of active biblical listening. So, my son, if you receive my words, this is beginning in verse 1. My son, if you receive my words and treasure up my commandments with you. So notice already, receive and then treasure up. So don't just take, but take on board and hold. So making your ear attentive to wisdom and inclining your heart to understanding. So you listen with the ear, then you engage the message with the heart. That's a different exercise. We can listen and engage with the head, but the Proverbs would have us listen and engage with the heart. But notice here in terms of describing what active listening really is. Yes, if you call out for insight, raise your voice for understanding. We should never have an opportunity like this, or a Bible class, or even a Sunday morning sermon. Obviously the time to ask a question is not in the middle of a sermon, but somebody gets up and says something and you don't understand. Afterwards, go up and talk to that person and say, I'd really like to know more about that, or what did you mean when you said this? And it doesn't always have to be an accusation. Sometimes we only ask with the aim of attack. I heard something that was wrong and I want to address that. But no, ask first for what it says here: insight, understanding. Get in the habit of doing that, but not just ask and lift up your voice. Verse 4: if you seek it like silver and search for it as hidden treasures, value it, prioritize it. Notice there are all of these if statements: if, and then in verse 5. Then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. Active listening is more than just simple reading or simple attendance to an opportunity to learn. It's actually engaging in that message. And so you can challenge yourself to think about how you could actually carry that out and engage in the message in a more active way. Wisdom is equated with God's guidance in terms of the outcomes of listening. And you see first then in verse 5, but then an ongoing then in verse 9, and the outcome of all of that. For wisdom will come into your heart, and then this is what will be the outcome of all those things: delivering you from evil ways, verse 12, and then also delivering you from again, from the standpoint of a father talking to his son, illicit relationships. That comes up a lot in the text. You'll be delivered in verse 16 from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words. I intended to have my New King James with me this evening, but I actually brought my ESV here, and so reading out of the ESV. But we'll go ahead and make this point about the forbidden woman or the adulteress, because I see that there's a little notation on that here, and I wonder what it has here in my margin here, but nothing super helpful. The term, forbidden or adulteress, and I can't remember which is which to differentiate at this point. It's easier with New King James. At times, there's an implied meaning that is taken in our translation. It's actually different than the original meaning, of more of like a stranger or a foreigner. And the older versions tended to do that. I wonder if I pulled up let's pull up my other electronic Bible here to tell you which word we're talking about here. It's always good to have these tools with you. Yeah, so the term adulteress there, you'll notice the older versions will say something like stranger, and that's actually closer to the actual meaning of the word. So this isn't just a woman who is cheating on her husband or something like that. A stranger, from the context of the Proverbs, is anyone that you're not supposed to have intimacy with, and so not just a person who's already married, but someone who is technically like stranger, like a Gentile or foreigner, like someone who's not supposed to be in your scope or your sphere, right? And so there's a very a very guardedness that comes from these 9 chapters of how we engage people of the opposite sex, and how we view people that are brought into spheres of intimacy. You would not find Proverbs 1 through 9 guiding people towards these what are common today, these platonic relationships between men and women, where oh, we're just friends and that kind of thing. There's a relational intimacy that the father is going to talk about in chapter 5 that he wants his son to have with his wife, and then that same kind of intimacy is not really supposed to be shared by him and other women, because of the dangers that come with that. And so again, when you're reading the term adulteress, don't always assume that this is about a lustful married woman. It's really about someone who's a stranger and ought to be kept as a stranger from intimate relation. All right, but getting into chapter 3, and we're kind of like I said, we're kind of breezing through and hitting the high points here. If you have questions about anything that in the text, we're moving forward, feel free to stop me and let me know what your questions are. But getting to chapter 3, you find an examination of trust. So the key reading here then would be verse 5 and 6. Give my voice a break. If someone could read verses 5 and 6, please.
3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight.
Here's a little question for us to reflect on. What does it mean to trust in the Lord? So to trust in the Lord. So what does that mean?
Like faith in the Lord.
Yeah,
Confidence.
faith is faith. I like to I don't have you ever sang the hymn "Trust and Obey" before?
Yeah.
I like to illustrate faith using that hymn, and that a component of faith is obviously then trust. Obedience is also a component of biblical faith. It's what differentiates faith from the belief that is mentioned in James 2 as the demons believe and tremble, but they don't have faith, do they? Because they don't have obedience. You could also argue they don't have trust, but so it's a component of faith, but it's not the same as faith. What is trust?
Letting the fear of the Lord rule in your heart.
Letting the fear of the Lord rule in your heart is certainly so. There's a practicality to that. You use the word rule, and so seeing yourself as an extension of the Lord and for His service. So the Lord rules over what direction I take. I think that you can think of
the trust is like.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Sorry, give yourself to the Lord.
Yeah, it's so trust is giving yourself, as you mentioned, to the Lord. It's a measurement of depth and diameter. So what will you do, and to what extent will you do it? Full trust in the Lord would be, I will do whatever the Lord says, and I will do it in any circumstance or in any condition. There's so it's really, there's a reason why trust and obedience so often travel together, and why that really is a component of biblical faith, because if there's not full trust, there won't ever really be consistent and full obedience. And you can see that in the language here. To trust in the Lord is to not lean on our own understanding, to not allow ourselves to direct our paths, but rather to allow Him to direct our paths, what we ultimately do. Good. I appreciated the contribution there. And notice how it quickly turns not just to honoring God with obedience, but also with generosity. In verse 9, honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruit of all your produce. How is that an exercise in trust, to honor the Lord with the first fruit of all your produce? What is the first fruit?
Well, that's
You're putting God first.
Yeah.
Yeah, Nicholas.
sorry, Shane, you first. I've talked a lot tonight.
You go, Nicholas.
Oh, okay. So you had putting God first. I was going to say that, obviously that's a reference to the sacrifices, right, of the temple, of what they did under the Mosaic
Yep.
law, right? That they would sacrifice, they'd literally give to God. Well, not literally, but in a both symbolic and very real way, give up the first of what they had, the first of their crops, the first of their flock, the first of whatever they were producing, in a society that produced a lot more than we do today, where not many of us are actually, kind of first tier producers of things. And they offer that up to God. And part of that was, well, showing that God is first, right? That the God is important enough that we'll give him this very important thing. But the second part is that I trust that God will give me more. Right. I trust that God will bless us. He's given us this land. He's told us that as long as we're faithful to him, we will prosper in this land. And so if I give up I don't need to hoard everything I can get my hands on, because I trust that God will continue to provide for me. And so I give this up to him in grateful willingness, because I know who he is and what he'll keep doing for me.
In the context of the Old Testament, wouldn't the first, putting aside the sacrificial thing, wouldn't the first fruits, as we look at the great chapter of faith in Hebrews, be faithful life of each of the faithful people that are described? And so the first fruits is their faithful life.
Yeah, well, so it's a principle that is, as Nicholas described, that yields the kind of life that Hebrews 11 describes. So the principle is that, and it's from the agricultural world, as he mentioned, that you get, like, let's just take a tree, for instance. You get a fruit-bearing tree. The first fruit, literally, that comes out is not yours at all. So what that implies in terms of, just picturing that, is you've been waiting all season for the harvest time, anticipating the fruit that's going to come. You've been living off of the previous year's stores, and maybe those previous year's stores are getting less and less, and maybe they're getting to where they're not there at all. And you're eagerly anticipating this new fruit coming. To trust God is to take that new fruit, which is also going to be the best fruit that tree produces, and just saying, God, I'm going to give you that. I'm going to give you what is first and what is best. The scoffer would say, well, what are you going to do when the tree doesn't produce anything else? I have had, because I'm not a good farmer by any means, I've had times where I've had a tomato plant, or even a fruit tree. When we lived down in Arizona, we had a couple of citrus trees that we planted, and we had a first fruit, so to speak, of those trees, and then nothing else came after that. Did something wrong, obviously. I don't know, but what happened to me could happen, because maybe the environmental conditions change even for the best farmers, where they don't get anything else. The scoffer says, why would you give that to God? Maybe you should make sure that you're provided for first and then give to God. But that would be the opposite of trust.
When you talk about layers of meaning, Patrick,
sure,
I'm thinking in the New Testament context that Jesus talked about a harvest.
Yeah.
And we are that harvest, and we are that's the kind of layer of meaning that I see here.
I would take it, the concept of fruit bearing is a frequently visited concept in the New Testament. So yes, while we are the Lord's harvest, and first fruit references actually converts at times, But Paul talks about the first fruits of the gospel being those who earliest obeyed the gospel. But I think that more often you see that in terms of agricultural, things like, well, what are we as Christians to bear? For example, the fruit of the Spirit. What are we to do with the Word of God? We are to see it bear fruit in our lives if we are the good soil. Matthew 13 talks about, the different multipliers there of how much fruit you would bear, the product of your obedience, so to speak. And so there are lessons here when you're thinking about this illustration for giving. There's lessons for activity in general, and there's a principle of honoring God in the first place, honoring God with the best, and honoring God consistently. As when you think about lifelong fruit bearing, as you're talking about. But yeah, there's so much that you could reflect upon, and I love that we're doing that already with our study of the book of Proverbs. Well, let's try to roll through chapter 3 and just hit those high points, and then we'll wrap up for class tonight. Pick up with chapter 4, Lord willing, next time. And but we're not there yet, so let's finish chapter 3. So chapter 3, verses 11 through 20, it talks about accepting correction. This is a very important concept, proverbially speaking, and I don't mean that in terms of comparatively speaking, but in terms of just speaking about the Proverbs. There's a great deal of importance of receiving correction and actually responding to correction. So, blessed is the one who or rather, my son, beginning verse 11, do not despise the Lord's discipline or be weary of his reproof, for the Lord reproves whom he loves, a father, the son in whom he delights. So the Lord reproves or chastens those whom he loves. If you don't encounter negative information as you study the Bible, in other words, things that negate what you do or believe, then you're studying yourself probably instead of studying the Bible. The Lord does bring correction and change into our lives as we understand him further.
Patrick,
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Your reference there, verse 11 to 10.
11 and 12.
11 to 12, okay.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
Did you have a question about that, or were you asking just for the reference?
No,
you've got a typo.
Your slide is wrong, that's all.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for that. So let me see if I can fix that for you. 20. That would make more sense.
11 to 20. Okay.
That makes more sense. And that's me accepting your correction, Brother Joseph. So there we go. But verses 21 through 26, the importance of living confidently. And again, we're dividing these up by that formula, my son. So verse 21, my son, do not lose sight of these, keep sound wisdom, and then you will walk on your way securely. And if you lie down, you'll not be afraid. So you can see how a part of imparting faith is not only encouraging to deep obedience and to trust, but also illustrating the fruit of that. What do we get when we trust the Lord, and how are we cared for as we do so? What's the positive outcome of the faith? I find that we do at times more talking about something being right than we do about it being good. But people today, especially the people who are not accustomed to religion and faith, they need to hear a lot about why it's good. And they're actually watching us already to see whether or not it's good. Like the one of the great apologetics of the Christian faith is how I live, my life. And if people see me to be generally to be a happy and secure person, not necessarily to be a successful person, because people can see past that. But a person who feels confident in his life and isn't tossed about by what is happening in his life, that does a lot to show the value of faith. And I think that's what you see on display here in these verses. The Lord will be your confidence. Even though there's not a my son that begins this next section, you find a change in the information to the importance of being a good neighbor. I love the principle of verse 27, to not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it is in your power to do it. To actually, when you have the opportunity to do good, as Paul said, as we have opportunity, is not as we have convenience. We often read it that way, don't we? As we have convenience, let's do good to all men. But from the standpoint of the Proverbs, it's if I have it in my hand, I have the opportunity, and therefore I ought to do it, or to give it in this case. Then, as the chapter closes out, the importance of not envying wicked neighbors. Verse 31, do not envy a man of violence, not choose his ways. The Lord's curses on the house of the wicked. Verse 33, he blesses the dwelling of the righteous. We need to speak plainly about those who are not on the Lord's side and what is the outcome of their life. All right, well, that's the first 3 chapters of the book of Proverbs. I know we've really kind of breezed through that material, and we'll have to do that. Again, my hope is that later in our study we'll slow down when we engage maybe Ecclesiastes and hopefully Song of Solomon as well. But what questions do we have over these first 3 chapters of Proverbs? All right, well, we will go ahead and close out with a word of prayer, and then the evening will be yours. Well, let's go ahead and pray. Most holy God, thank you so much for the blessing of being able to grow in our understanding of wisdom by reflecting upon what you have taught in the Proverbs. Father, we appreciate so much that you are our Father, and that you guide us not just in ways that are good and right, but in ways that are best, and ways that are practical, useful. Thank you, God, for rewarding our trust and for yielding the beautiful fruit of peace in our lives. Thank you for this time we've been able to spend, and bless us as we strive to put these things into practice in the week ahead. And we offer this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Well, God bless you, and we'll go ahead and stop our recording for this evening.